This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Did you know that one of America's greatest original aircraft carriers has been forgotten at the bottom of the sea, with planes she once carried scattered about like an eerie scene from a science fiction film? This is USS Wasp, a lost veteran of the Second World War with an amazing reputation but an overlooked history. What is this ship's story? Join me to learn her secrets as today we discover the lost USS Wasp. I'm your host Ryan Socash and you're watching It's History. I think it's important to point out that aircraft carriers are marvelous examples of the world's most cutting-edge modern technologies all working together. And to make that a reality, years of innovation were needed, hence this story goes back a very long way. And for context, I'd like to offer you a quick overview on the prehistory of aerial warfare. Historians suggest that the first examples of aerial warfare can be found during the War of the Three Kingdoms in China between 220 and 280 AD. Before he died in 234, the imperial minister of Shuhan would use paper lanterns to signal his forces for attacks and to indicate to allies when he or his enemy were encircled. Centuries later, in France, famous hot air balloons, thrill seekers, early weather scientists, and the first aviators raced to see who could build the bigger balloon, who could go higher, and who could travel the furthest. With that in mind, aircraft carriers long predate the Wright brothers' first powered flight. Early examples could be found in 1849 when the Habsburg Empire bombed the then city-state of Venice from above with dozens of unmanned hot air balloons released from the surrounding hills and barges in the Adriatic, dropping 33-pound bombs onto the city during an almost year-long siege. Later, during the American Civil War, the Union Army Balloon Corps would use hot air balloons launched from the north and river barges to spy on and monitor Confederate troop movements. But ultimately, it would be World War I that the world would finally build an aircraft carrier as we know them today. By 1914, early seaplane carriers were already an established concept. These ships would carry planes designed with large pontoons below the airframe to a designated area and launch them from a calm sea or catapult to extend their search radius and provide targeted support. While just about every major nation tried this, the truest adopter was the Royal Navy, where early proponents for naval air power were gaining traction against the gun club. This would expand even further by launching the HMS Furious in 1916. Originally designated as a light battle cruiser, by the time she was nearly completed, the Navy knew this design was a dead end and began converting her into a testing bed for the catapult launch and recovery of aircraft with floats using the flat deck built on the back of the ship. Furious would become the first ship to launch and recover aircraft without retrieving them from the water. America's earliest designs carried the same hybrid energy, with the first American carrier being the converted collier USS Jupiter, renamed Langley. The next two were the converted battle cruisers USS Lexington and Saratoga. But from there, the US's first purpose-built and designated aircraft carriers were Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. To understand the first aircraft carrier, Wasp, we have to understand the mentality of the American Navy before World War II. In short, they were a navy restricted by the Washington Naval Treaty that bound each major navy to only having a certain weight permissible in every fleet category: cruisers, battleships, submarines, and aircraft carriers. So after building York and Enterprise, the United States Navy was only left with another 15,000 tons for another aircraft carrier, as anything greater would exceed the treaty. Still intending to build a ship within this range, the Navy drafted the plans for a scaled-down Yorktown-class carrier to make up the remaining permissible tonnage. As a result, Wasp was laid down on April 1st, 1936 at the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Yard and launched 3 years and 8 days later in a dramatically changed world. During this time, the Washington Naval Treaty had collapsed, and Germany, Italy, and Japan were all building or had built massive battleships above treaty confines. By the time she was commissioned into the fleet in 1940, Hitler and Stalin had invaded Poland, and her two half-sisters were now 3, with Hornet being well underway in construction. Furthermore, in the age of Spitfire Hurricane, Me-109, and Zero, her original complement of largely biplane aircraft was wildly obsolete. Thankfully, before things had become too desperate, naval procurement improved enough for the ship to be armed in a more meaningful way, but she still lacked the actual aircraft. You see, she was a respectable ship, but underprotected and had machinery of a slightly poorer quality than her half-sisters, so the Navy understood that they had to use her very carefully. Despite her size constraints, Wasp included design features we now know as commonplace, such as side-mounted aircraft elevators complementing the 2 centrally installed elevators. She would stay on patrol missions in the North Atlantic throughout the war until America entered the fighting in 1942. She would enter the company of Joint Convoy Escorts and eventually support the British fleet concretely, alongside Force W during the resupply mission to Malta, where on April 20th, 1942, Wasp launched 47 RAF Spitfire towards the island, providing valuable air coverage from German and Italian bombardment and helping guarantee the island's survival, weakening the Axis air forces and diverting their attention from the more valuable British North African campaigns. Shortly after this, considering losses and battles with the Japanese Navy intensifying, Admiral Nimitz demanded Wasp and many other more modern ships join the Pacific Fleet to gain an advantage and stem his losses. Her elder sister, Lexington, and Yorktown were both sunk, and despite their losses, Japan could still gain an advantage if they weren't reinforced. Despite modernizing her air wing, being under heavy escort, and early tactical success in air raids, Wasp's career in the Pacific ended in fire on September 15th, 1942, when the Japanese submarine I-19 fired a full spread of torpedoes into the ship, with 3 of them ripping through the weak armor and the bar. Wasp, CV-7, and the 8th American warship of her name would be lost. To make matters worse, the torpedoes that missed Wasp hit the battleship North Carolina and destroyer O'Brien. The ship's damage control would struggle with the flooding for hours, but was eventually abandoned and scuttled by one of her remaining destroyers. The story doesn't end here. You see, almost as soon as she was lost, one of the new SS-class carriers, the Oriskany, was renamed Wasp before her christening on November 13th and launched on August 17th, 1943. The SS-class was larger and incorporated improved armor, longer hulls, and flight decks, and utilized the side-mounted elevators from the Wasp and Hornet. The fully loaded Wasp weighed over 26,000 long tons, 7,000 tons heavier than the original carrier. 8 boilers and 4 screws meant she could reach speeds of 32 knots and a cruising speed of about 28 knots. Much higher than the original ship since they had saved weight by only incorporating 2 propeller shafts. She was a further 40 meters longer at the flight deck at 265 meters. This was complemented with improved armor and damage control and a massive increase in anti-aircraft protection, including 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns, mostly focused in the 4 double-barrel turrets, protecting the fore and aft of the island and command decks. Her strike component, the most impressive of all, was originally 36 Wildcat fighter planes, 36 more Dauntless dive bombers, and 18 Avenger torpedo and level bombers. The features of these ships and military vehicles are so impressive that it's almost difficult to put into words, but if you'd like to get really in depth, then you should check out the sponsor of this video. War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. My favorite feature is their massive collection of vehicles, spanning over 100 years, from the 1920s to modern day. This is the perfect game for history lovers, since every vehicle is accurately detailed all the way down to their individual components. There are over 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships to choose from, and what will be a dynamic experience of combined arms and peer versus peer battles. So if you'd like to immerse yourself in history with incredible 4K graphics and dynamic vehicle damage mode, I've got you covered. You can play free now on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, or the previous console generation by clicking my link in the description below. New War Thunder players across all platforms, as well as those who haven't played in the past 6 months, can claim a large bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, an exclusive 3D decorator for vehicles, and much more by using our link in the description. This reincarnation of Wasp would embark aircraft in Norfolk and eventually reach Pearl Harbor on April the 4th, 1944. Wasp and Essex would heavily damage Japanese forces on Marcus and Wake Islands on May the 19th, 20th, and 24th, preventing them from interfering with the developing invasion of Saipan by American forces. This would only be the start of a long and successful career. Starting on June the 6th, American carriers and land-based bombers heavily attacked Saipan and Tinian, destroying their ability to resist or repel the American invasion. When escort carriers took over that role, the fleet carriers bombed Iwo Jima, preventing Japanese aviation from interfering from the north and softening them for invasion. During their raids, Japan had resolved to destroy the invasion of Saipan, no matter how unlikely or how high the cost was. Japan dispatched Admiral Ozawa and the 1st Mobile Fleet for the Sulu Islands, while Admiral Spruance's carriers were hammering Saipan and Iwo Jima. They were spotted by an increasing number of American submarines who now roamed the northern Pacific like sharks. With the linking reports coming in from submarines, the American carriers took to the center of a massive defensive formation. The Marines on Saipan had no idea that the fleet had left to finish one of the most intense naval rivalries in history. Ozawa had 3 fleet carriers, 6 light and seaplane carriers, plus battleships and assorted escorts. Spruce's 6th Fleet had almost 600 ships, including 8 fleet carriers, 7 light carriers, 7 battleships, and escorting cruisers, destroyers, and logistic vessels. Ozawa counted on land-based support from the Army and naval bombers stationed on Guam near the American fleet, but these Japanese aircraft had already been hammered by Spruce's fleet. Unclear communication and embarrassment at the scale of their defeat meant the Japanese command never understood the scale of their losses on Guam. 1st Air Fleet Commander Kakuta would even report that his air fleet was dealing significant damage to the Americans. They weren't. Most of his planes were either dispersed, hidden, or burning. Unaware of the scale of their enemy or the lack of support his planes would face, Ozawa launched his fighters on the morning of June 19th. Over 300 Japanese planes met the American Combat Air Patrol in the first wave, counting on support from Kakuta that would never come. Around 50 miles from their carriers, the American pilots devastated the first wave of Japanese attackers. Guided by accurate radar information from the battleships and destroyers, many American pilots would destroy 5 Japanese planes in the first sortie. The inexperienced and poorly trained Japanese pilots, combined with bad military intelligence and wildly inferior aircraft, failed with only a handful being able to reach and attack the American fleet, dealing no decisive damage to the capital ships. Furthermore, the American submarines, Cavella and Albacore, would sink 2 of Japan's largest carriers. Spruce and Mitcher's planes would then sink a 3rd Japanese carrier and damage 2 more. The world knows this as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, with us Americans calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. After Ozawa's defeat at the Marianas, the US Navy proceeded with its plan to secure the island and the Philippines. During these campaigns, Wasp stuck to her role of destroying Japanese aircraft and shore bases in the northern Marianas, Taiwan, and eventually traveling back south with the fleet to participate in the climatic invasion of Leyte. In late October, she and her sisters provided close air support for the landing Marines holding positions south of the island. This too would trigger Japanese Combined Fleet Commander Admiral Toyota into another pitched battle with the American fleet. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carriers, would sail from the home islands to distract and lure away the American fast attack carriers. Then, with them gone, the remaining Japanese battleships would encircle Leyte and Luzon to destroy the American landing zones and logistical ships as much as they could before the carriers returned. Even if that plan worked, it would be suicide for all ships. There was no denying that American air power would doubtlessly destroy the final Japanese carriers, including the last survivor of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Spotted and buffeted by American submarines and planes, the Japanese southerly attack of cruisers and battleships advanced from the east and west of the islands. Wasp and her sisters would unknowingly follow the Japanese plan. Wasp charged to destroy the Japanese aircraft carriers and watched as her half-sister, Enterprise, and the New Lexington destroyed the Japanese ships in acts of cosmic revenge. Wasp would not participate in the later attack on the dreadnought Yamato, but that wouldn't change the ship's fate later during the Battle of Okinawa. After revenge and ultimate victory over Japan, Wasp and her sisters would ferry back thousands of American soldiers and Marines for their trip home, making laps of the journey as men, living and dead, saw the war ended. But after the war, her story didn't end. Wasp would continuously serve the US Navy throughout most of the early Cold War, patrolling in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific. In 1952, she was redesignated as a carrier vessel auxiliary as new warships such as the Midway dwarfed her in size and complement of increasingly large turboprop and early jet aircraft. 2 years later, she would provide air cover to evacuate Chinese nationalist forces as Mao's Communist Army took increasing control of China's fringe territories. After a modernization to add a new angled flight deck, enabling jet and helicopter operations, and 2 more years in the Pacific, she was reclassified as an anti-submarine carrier vessel in 1956. From there, she was transferred to the Atlantic Fleet, where she would receive an air wing of anti-submarine helicopters and aviators. Years of training and modernization followed before she became a central anti-submarine ship in the North Atlantic. What's more, she's one of the many ships used during the Cuban naval blockade in 1962. Watching for submarines and Soviet cargo vessels, after tensions relaxed, she returned to more normal patrols across the Atlantic coast. In the last week of March 1966, she would be the recovery ship for the Gemini 13 space capsule. She would return astronauts Captain James Lovell and Major Edwin Aldrin to the United States with 2 days of jubilant celebration. Wasp continued naval operations until 1972, when she was stricken from the Navy's active roster and sent to the mothballs. At the height of her career, Wasp represented the height of the fleet itself. The SS-class carriers were the single most mass-produced fleet carrier in world history. They more than replaced the lost American aircraft carriers during the war and expanded the American Navy into the long-range, expeditionary force that it is so synonymous with today. But 1972, she was at the end of her life. 13 years of hard service and globe-trotting adventures had worn out her hull and machinery, and with larger ships and heavier aircraft coming online year after year in the late Cold War, she and her sisters were wholly obsolete. While some would be saved from the breakers, Wasp was scrapped shortly after her final decommissioning. However, before she was broken, she and her sisters guided the United States Navy into its current form. In their last active years, the Essex sisters developed and tested the tactics the fleet would use for naval helicopters, modern amphibious landing, and anti-submarine missions while patrolling the East Coast or tailing Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic and Mediterranean. While Wasp would miss some of the most strategic Pacific theater battles, such as Coral Sea and Midway, she proved her worth and honored her name. Now, with both ships seemingly lost to America's public memory and one laying at the bottom of the ocean, she is still honored in the Navy, where the 10th ship of her name, the Wasp-class landing helicopter dock, patrols with America's flagship carriers, fully loaded with Marines who can launch from helicopters, amphibious assault vehicles, and hovercraft. This Wasp has served the Navy since 1989 and remains active today to deploy American servicemen to any country in the North Atlantic or Mediterranean in a state of natural or man-made crisis. Meanwhile, the original carrier Wasp was rediscovered in 2019 by civilian researchers above the RV Petrel. She is permanently resting almost 14,000 feet below the waters of Guadalcanal, the site of the heaviest naval fighting of World War II. Her old planes scatter the floor around her while her anti-air guns are still aiming above for the gunners scouring the skies for Japanese aircraft. Comfortably too deep for grave robbers and scrap thieves, she can now rest easily, knowing she is found and her stories will not be forgotten by the people she fought to protect and the prosperity she and her men sacrificed themselves for. Thanks again to War Thunder for supporting the channel. Make sure to click our link in the description to play now and claim your free bonus pack for new players and those who haven't played in 6 months. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.